evening. It's Thursday, August 27th. Texas and Louisiana dodge a bullet as the worst predictions of Hurricane Laura failed to materialize. Damage to the states is still extensive, and the environmental havoc wreaked on the region's chemical and oil facilities will take days to assess. President Trump to deliver his presidential renomination acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention tonight as the self-proclaimed law and order candidate, while an unprecedented revolt against racism and systemic police brutality roils America's professional sports. In a preemptive strike, Democratic vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris blasts Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic and voices support for the protests that have broken out in Wisconsin following the police shooting of Jacob Blake. Infectious disease specialist Dr. Anthony Fauci directly criticizes new CDC guidelines, which say that asymptomatic people exposed to someone with COVID-19 need not be tested. Fauci says he was under general anesthesia in the operating room for surgery on a polyp and was not part of any discussion or deliberations regarding the new testing recommendations at the White House Coronavirus Task Force meeting. And nearly all of the Republicans in the California Senate barred today from entering the state capitol after they were exposed to the coronavirus. They'll be allowed to vote via video conference from their homes over the coming days, as lawmakers have until midnight Monday to pass bills. From Pacifica Radio, KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, this is the Evening News. I'm Mark Miracle. At least 4 people were killed as Hurricane Laura stormed into Texas and Louisiana as a Category 4 hurricane, bringing torrential rains and rising seawater at about 1 a.m. local time, making landfall. 700,000 people are without power. The National Hurricane Center said Laura pounded the Gulf Coast with winds of 150 miles an hour. Louisiana, the hardest hit, with 4 dead, including a 14-year-old girl and a 60-year-old man, and some 600,000 of its residents without electricity. Louisiana Governor Bill Edwards.
We have learned of 4 deaths in Louisiana caused by this storm. All were related to trees falling on residences, which is in line with this being a major wind event. Obviously, I'm asking that we all lift up these families in prayer. And certainly I'm concerned that as we continue to go out and do primary and secondary search and rescue, we're going to find more fatalities. I hope not. I pray not. But that is why we go out and do those search and rescues.
Laura hit the U.S. after killing near 24 people in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where it knocked out power and caused intense flooding. More than 500,000 people were ordered to evacuate the Gulf Coast to avoid predicted storm surges as high as 20 feet. Tens of thousands of people filled hotels and slept in cars since officials did not want to open large shelters that could invite further spread of the coronavirus. Fear of infection caused some to defy evacuation orders and hunker down at their homes instead. Louisiana's Lieutenant Governor Billy Nungesser told ABC he hoped most people did evacuate for their own good.
Well, we know anyone that stayed that's close to the coast, we've got to pray for them because looking at the storm surge, there would be little chance of survival. And we know we've heard from 50 to 150 people may have stayed behind to ride this out. In Holly Beach, where they raised homes 15 feet after Rita, and many thought that might be safe, that would not survive this tidal surge. So we're hopeful most people got out.
Louisiana Governor Edwards mobilized the National Guard and said State Department of Wildfire crews will start searching and rescue efforts. The volunteer community-based Louisiana Cajun Navy group of boat owners is assisting in search and rescue efforts. Texas Governor Greg Abbott says he's sending resources to assist in hard-hit Louisiana since Laura did not bring the surge predicted in his state. Although damage was done to thousands of structures, Texas was largely spared the bulk of destruction. Governor Abbott says the state dodged a bullet.
We dodged a bullet. It could have been far worse. We were anticipating, and it was prognosticated, that there would be a storm surge that could very easily exceed 10 feet. I was told earlier that the storm surge was about 3 feet, and that 7-foot differential means all the difference. We would not be gathering here right now had we seen a 10-foot or higher foot storm surge in this region like what was anticipated earlier. And so when you consider the magnitude of the damage that could have occurred here, we did dodge a bullet.
Forecasters warn of widespread flash flooding in states far from the coast. Hurricane Laura has since been downgraded to a tropical storm as it makes its way toward Arkansas. But forecasters warn the storm was so powerful that it could regain some strength after turning east and reaching the Atlantic Ocean, potentially then threatening the densely populated Northeast. Laura is the 7th named storm to strike the United States this year, setting a new record for storm landfalls by the end of August. The old record was 6 back in 1886 and then again in 1916. Laura is also tied with 5 other storms for the 5th most powerful U.S. hurricane. Noah Diffenbaugh is a climatologist who now connects the science of global warming with specific weather events, like Hurricane Laura, a discipline called climate attribution science.
Anytime there's an extreme event, multiple factors came together to create that event, right? We're talking about events that are in the tail of the distribution, variability in terms of, the noise in the climate system by definition plays a role in creating extremes. And we have very strong evidence that global warming is influencing both the probability and severity of many kinds of extreme climate events. And, the storm surge flooding from landfalling tropical storms is one of the most direct one of the areas where global warming has the most direct effect. We know that global warming has caused sea levels to rise. And so what this means is that for a given landfalling hurricane, for exactly the same storm surge from a hurricane of a given strength and a given orientation, the risk of storm surge flooding has increased because that storm surge, the pushing onto land of water, from the ocean onto land as the storm makes landfall, that's now happening on a higher floor, right? The sea level has risen, and there's been quite a bit of research on this, research on Hurricane Katrina's storm surge, which is a very severe storm surge. There's been a lot of research on Superstorm Sandy. So, for example, the storm surge from Sandy was, about, was made, more than twice as likely, up to 3 times as likely from the sea level rise that has happened. So we have very clear evidence that just by raising sea levels, the risks of the kinds of extreme storm surge flooding that we're seeing in storms like Laura, that has been made more likely as a result of global warming.
Noah Diffenbaugh is professor of Earth Systems Science at Stanford University. A fire at a Louisiana chlorine plant erupted with thick, billowing smoke today after Hurricane Laura plowed through part of the country's petrochemical corridor with storm surges and fierce winds, forcing residents around the plant to shelter in their homes. The damage came 3 years to the month after the record rains of Hurricane Harvey inundated Houston's refineries, storage tanks, and chemical plants, unleashing dozens of toxic spills into surrounding communities' air, land, and water. State and federal aircraft were heading into the air over the battered Louisiana coast today, looking for signs of any other industrial damage or releases from Hurricane Laura. At Lake Charles, Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality workers with handheld monitors did not immediately detect any chlorine releases from the fire at the BioLab plant. BioLab's corporate parent said the plant had been shut down and evacuated ahead of the storm, and no plant employees were injured. Authorities ordered people around the plant in the heavily industrialized Lake Charles area to stay in their homes when the blaze was discovered after first light following the storm. Reports of leaks or other industrial problems can take days to emerge after severe weather because many plants have evacuated and locked down their facilities, and roads and phone lines are iffy. EPA spokeswoman Molly Block said her agency had been working with other governments and contractors before the storm hit to assess the storm security of 23 Superfund sites in Louisiana and 35 such sites in Texas. Tonight, President Trump accepts the Republican presidential nomination in a speech he'll deliver from the South Lawn of the White House. 1,000 people are expected to attend. The invitation to the event from the Republican National Committee says masks are not required and coronavirus tests will not be offered to all guests. If the previous nights of the convention are any guide, many of those in attendance will not be wearing facial coverings and will not stay 6 feet apart. A media advisory from a group called Long Live Go-Go says it will hold a sundown concert a block away from the White House to try to drown out Trump's, quote, racist rhetoric. Last night, in his acceptance speech, Vice President Mike Pence defended police and made a strident argument that Democrats will make the country less safe. Pence made no mention of the African Americans killed by police this year or the serious injuries suffered by Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, shot multiple times in the back by a police officer this week.
Last week, Joe Biden didn't say one word about the violence and chaos engulfing cities across this country. So let me be clear. The violence must stop, whether in Minneapolis, Portland, or Kenosha. Too many heroes have died defending our freedom to see Americans strike each other down. We will have law and order on the streets of this country for every American of every race and creed and color.
Pence addressed the proceedings even as new protests took place on the streets against police brutality and racism following the latest shooting of a black man by police. Black athletes led unprecedented action in response to Jacob Blake's shooting in Kenosha, starting with the Milwaukee Bucks of the National Basketball Association, who refused to take the floor yesterday for their playoff game. Bucks players George Hill and Sterling Brown.
Despite the overwhelming plea for change, there has been no action, so our focus today cannot be on basketball.
When we take the court and represent Milwaukee and Wisconsin, we are expected to play at a high level, give maximum effort, and hold each other accountable. We hold ourselves to that standard, and in this moment, we are demanding the same from lawmakers and law enforcement. We are calling for justice for Jacob Blake and demand the officers be held accountable.
2 other NBA games were postponed. Then players from the Women's National Basketball Association, Major League Baseball, and Major League Soccer joined the boycott. Former NBA player Kenny Smith walked off the set of the TNT show Inside NBA after delivering a solidarity statement.
As a black man, as a former player, I think it's best for me to support the players and just not be here tonight. And figure out what happens after that. Yeah, I just don't feel equipped to do that.
And I respect that.
More from reporter Simon Marks.
The NBA says playoffs scrubbed last night because of a player boycott in support of Black Lives Matter will resume later this week. President Trump says he now views the NBA as a political organisation. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, spoke on CNBC.
Look, I think that the NBA players are very fortunate that they have the financial position where they're able to take a night off from work without the consequences to themselves financially. So they have that luxury, which is great. There's a lot of activism, and I think that they've put a lot of slogans out, but I think that what we need to do is turn that from slogans and signals to actual action that's going to solve the problem.
Simon Marks, Washington.
And the boycotts continue today. 6 baseball games were canceled. 2 National Hockey League playoff matches were canceled, and a slate of games in the Women's National Basketball Association League were also scrubbed. You're listening to the evening news on KPFA in Berkeley, KPFK in Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org. After his boss's militant call to law and order last night, Vice President Mike Pence's chief of staff, Mark Short, said in a CNN interview today that the NBA protests are absurd and silly when compared to their response to ongoing human rights violations in China. Ruth Conniff, editor of the online publication The Wisconsin Examiner, told the Upfront Morning program with host Janine Etter of her feelings about what the Republican convention and Mike Pence are up to.
I think that the RNC is trying to stoke the kind of violence that we've seen in Kenosha. And I think that it is not a coincidence that when the RNC on its first night featured the McCloskeys, the couple who pointed loaded weapons at Black Lives Matter protesters and were charged with felonies for that, when they gave them a marquee primetime speaking slot in the first night of the convention, they were telegraphing a really dangerous message. And now here in Wisconsin, we see a white teenager who is a big Blue Lives Matter booster and a Trump fan, sat in the front row at a Trump rally, has shot and killed 2 people in Kenosha and put a 3rd protester in the hospital. And the thing that is so cynical and eerie about it is, if you listen to Mike Pence last night, and he did squeeze Kenosha into his remarks because, of course, the Republicans see what's happening in Kenosha as a political opportunity. They have been running down a list of American cities that they say are engulfed in chaos and violence. It's sort of this hellscape vision of America that Trump laid out in his inaugural address. They are bringing it to pass. They are encouraging white supremacists and conspiracy theorists to bring their own guns and, quote-unquote, defend themselves and make things safe. We have an interview with a militia member this morning who issued the call to arms in Kenosha and feels, in spite of the fact that the only people who have died in Kenosha are an unarmed black man shot by a white cop and 3 protesters shot by a white vigilante, that he was making things safer by getting people out with their guns. And that's a message that we heard echoed on the national stage at the Republican convention and by state Republicans here in Wisconsin who expressed their, support for, quote-unquote, citizens who had to, defend themselves with guns, even after this murder.
And what can Democrats do to take control of the narrative, in your opinion? Because they seem to be stuck between a rock and a hard place, not able to look at hard. They can't be hard on crime because it'll upset liberal-leaning supporters, and they can't be too lenient to upset conservative supporters.
Well, I think one thing that's really important is to reiterate what the reality is. The reality is the violence has not been committed by protesters. the violence has been committed by rogue police officers and white supremacist vigilantes. So to say that the answer to that is a stronger police presence and more vigilantism is just counterfactual. And I think, people are failing to make that connection. The Republicans hope that people fail to make that connection. But, what is safety? How do you actually protect public safety? And I think the Democrats who are in charge of both the cities where protests have taken place, and you see later at night riots devolving out of what had been more organized, peaceful protests, they are in a difficult situation. They're talking about being responsive to the legitimate anger of people who want to see police reformed, and they're trying to deal with a public safety situation and window breaking and arson, property crimes. But, the escalation to murder has happened thanks in part to rhetoric from the Republicans. So, I think that you're right that the Democrats are in a difficult situation. I think the difficult situation is governing. And how do you get control of a situation that, frankly, is out of control in part because the President of the United States is fanning the flames?
Ruth Conniff, at-large editor of the Progressive magazine and editor-in-chief of the Wisconsin Examiner. More on the next to the last day of the Republican National Convention from reporter Lily Bulkey.
I humbly accept your nomination to run and serve as Vice President of the United States.
Vice President Mike Pence headlined Day 3 of the Republican National Convention from Fort McHenry, another federal site. He sent prayers to those in Louisiana and Texas facing a dangerous hurricane, gave a revisionist history of President Trump's response to the coronavirus, and praised the reopening of schools, Trump's appointment of conservative justices, and anti-abortion policies.
We supported the right to life and all the God-given liberties enshrined in our Constitution, including the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms.
But nearly 450 faith leaders sent a letter this week demanding that President Trump and Republicans end the, quote, inhumane treatment of immigrants and their families. Reverend Ryan Eller with the New Moral Majority PAC says the anti-immigrant agenda doesn't reflect the values of people of faith.
Most Christians are fundamentally morally pained when they see family separation and kids abducted from their parents and thrown into these camps.
Second Lady Karen Pence commemorated 100 years since women fought for it and finally gained the right to vote. White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany and Lara Trump, the president's daughter-in-law and campaign advisor, as well as other women speakers, shared personal stories to show the president's softer side. Trump counselor Kellyanne Conway, who's leaving her job at the end of the month, lauded the number of women in the administration, even though more than 20 women have accused the president of sexual harassment or assault.
President Trump helped me shatter a barrier in the world of politics by empowering me to manage his campaign to its successful conclusion.
Multiple speakers from Mike Pence to Clarence Henderson, who participated in the historic 1960 Greensboro, North Carolina sit-ins, criticized Joe Biden's record on policing and criminal justice. President Trump tweeted yesterday that he's sending federal law enforcement to Kenosha, Wisconsin, another Democrat-led city, to, quote, restore law and order, unquote. From Pacifica Network and Public News Service, I'm Lily Bulkey.
According to two separate ethics complaints filed by government watchdog groups, two White House officials violated the Hatch Act by participating in choreographed events that were aired during this week's Republican National Convention. The group Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, or CREW, wrote in a complaint filed today that Chad Wolf, the acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, violated the law when he appeared during a taped naturalization ceremony on White House grounds with President Trump. Yesterday, two law school professors filed a separate complaint against Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, arguing that he committed an egregious violation by delivering a videotaped speech from Israel. The Hatch Act is a 1939 law that's intended to limit the commingling of political activity and government business, although it does not apply directly to the president and vice president. While Wolf and Pompeo were ostensibly performing their official duties, the watchdog groups contend the events were staged and intended for use during an overtly political event, the Republican convention, and are thus violations of the act. The Trump White House has flouted the ethics, rules, and norms that guided past administrations, and Wolf and Pompeo now join a long list of other Trump officials who have taken a cavalier approach specifically towards the Hatch Act. White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows dismissed concerns about such violations, telling Politico, nobody outside of the Beltway really cares. President Trump will be on the campaign trail tomorrow with a rally in Manchester, New Hampshire. Laura Rossbrow-Tellem reports.
According to news website 538, Trump is trailing Biden here by about 8%, similar to national trends. University of New Hampshire political science professor Dante Scala says Trump needs to win over Granite State college-educated men and rural voters, as well as a key group favoring Biden.
Senior voters, people who are 65 and over, compared to 4 years ago, Joe Biden so far has been doing better among seniors than Hillary Clinton did.
Trump is slated to speak near Manchester-Boston Regional Airport Friday at 6 p.m. Scala thinks Trump's best strategy is to focus on the economy, arguing he's the better candidate to restore it to pre-COVID heights. Professor Andy Smith is director of the University of New Hampshire Survey Center. He notes that before the pandemic, it was a boom market, and most political analysts expected Trump to win re-election. But now, Smith isn't sure, and not because of the large percentage of independent voters in New Hampshire, about 40%.
You can register Republican, Democrat, or undeclared. And if you look at those people who are registered undeclared, they roughly break out about 35, 38% Democrats, 32 to 35% Republicans, and the rest of those people are truly independent.
Smith says most real independents are less likely to vote and pay less attention to politics, including going to a rally. I'm Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, reporting for Public News Service.
A judge is ordering an Iowa county to invalidate 50,000 requests for absentee ballots, agreeing with President Trump's campaign that the county elections commissioner overstepped his authority by pre-filling them out with the voters' personal information. The judge issued a temporary injunction that orders Lynn County to contact those voters in writing to inform them that the forms should not have been pre-filled with their information and cannot be processed. Instead, voters will have to either fill out new blank requests for absentee ballots or vote in person on Election Day. A Democratic congressman is demanding that Postmaster General Louis DeJoy hand over all of his secret communications with the Trump campaign after he admitted in testimony before the House Oversight Committee earlier this week that he was in contact with people associated with the Trump presidential campaign since taking charge of the U.S. Postal Service. Virginia Congressman Jerry Connolly, chair of the House Subcommittee on Government Operations, wrote in a letter to DeJoy that during the Oversight Committee hearing on Monday, the Postmaster General appeared to change his testimony that he gave under oath last week to the Republican-controlled Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. DeJoy, a Republican mega donor to President Trump, said he had not spoken to any Trump campaign officials about the post office since his appointment, but when questioned about it on Monday, DeJoy conceded that he had. In a speech on Capitol Hill today, Democratic vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris blasted President Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic just hours before Trump plans to speak on the final night of the Republican National Convention. Harris voiced support for the protests which have broken out in Wisconsin following the police shooting of Jacob Blake, an African-American man, shot 7 times in the back. KPFA's Kate Eder reports.
More than 180,000 people in the United States have died from the coronavirus during a pandemic that has ravaged the nation at a higher rate than most other countries in the world. In a speech just hours before the last night of the Republican National Convention, Democratic vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris blasted President Donald Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic.
Donald Trump has failed at the most basic and important job of a president of the United States. He failed to protect the American people. Trump showed that we in the legal profession would call a reckless disregard for the well-being of the American people. Donald Trump's incompetence is nothing new. But in January of this year, it became deadly.
Harris pointed out that Trump disbanded the National Security Council team founded by then-President Barack Obama and Vice President Joe Biden, which focused on preparing for a pandemic. She highlighted Trump's push to cut Social Security payroll taxes and warned that if his plan goes through, disability payments would end within a year and Social Security payments would end in 3 years. She also focused on the Trump administration's lawsuit to eliminate the Affordable Care Act, which is helping many Americans receive health care during the pandemic. Harris also criticized the Republican National Convention, which she said was only meant to, quote, soothe Donald Trump's ego, end quote. She said Republicans have failed to accurately depict the toll of the coronavirus during their convention. Harris painted Joe Biden as a president who would address the pandemic seriously.
We have a chance to right these wrongs and put America on a better path forward. One where the leaders we elect listen to the experts and follow the best medical guidance. One where we take meaningful action against systems and traditions of oppression. One where we stop fanning the flames of hate and division. As Joe Biden said, we have a choice between the light and the dark. I believe America will choose the light.
Harris pledged support for the people who have been affected by California's destructive wildfires and Hurricane Laura, which has blasted communities in Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas, among others, but has received little attention at the Republican National Convention. Harris also defended the protesters who have taken to the streets following the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Blake, a 29-year-old black father of 6, was shot 7 times in the back, paralyzing him from the waist down. Protesters are demanding an end to racial injustice and police brutality.
People are rightfully angry and exhausted. And after the murders of Breonna and George and Ahmaud and so many others, it's no wonder people are taken to the streets. And I support them. We must always defend peaceful protest and peaceful protesters. We should not confuse them with those looting and committing acts of violence, including the shooter who was arrested for murder. And make no mistake, we will not let these vigilantes and extremists derail the path to justice.
Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden has advocated for overhauling U.S. police practices after years of high-profile killings of Black Americans by officers, though he does not support defunding the police. Harris, a California senator, is sponsoring a bill in Congress to ban certain police practices like chokeholds and no-knock warrants and create a national registry for police misconduct. Reporting for KPFA Pacifica Radio, I'm Kate Ida.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says she doesn't think Democrat Joe Biden should debate President Trump this year, saying she believes Trump will belittle what the debates are supposed to be about and engage in another exercise in skullduggery.
I wouldn't legitimize a conversation with him, nor a debate in terms of the presidency of the United States. Now, I know that the Biden campaign thinks in a different way about this, but I thought what he did in the 2016 was disgraceful, stalking Hillary Clinton like that. I was disappointed that the press didn't say, go back to your station. You're not here. You don't own this stage. You have your own podium. She has hers. So I think that he'll probably act in a way that is beneath the dignity of the presidency. He does that every day.
Pelosi suggested instead the two candidates have individual events where they take questions from reporters. Biden has said he's eager to take on Trump in 3 debates this fall. The Nonpartisan Commission on Presidential Debates recently rejected a request from the Trump campaign to either add a 4th general election debate or move up the calendar for the contests. Trump's campaign said 16 states will have already started voting by the time of the first scheduled debate on September 29th. You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online, kpfa.org. It's an hour-long newscast airing each night at 6. And it's archived online at kpfa.org. You can listen whenever you like to it. I'm Mark Miracle. Black Lives Matter activists are holding their first Black National Convention tomorrow, a virtual event that will adopt a political agenda calling for slavery reparations, universal basic income, environmental justice, and legislation that entirely reimagines criminal justice reform. The gathering follows the Democratic and Republican Party conventions that laid out starkly different visions for America. It also comes on the heels of yet another shooting by a white police officer of an African-American man, this time 29-year-old Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. That has sparked days of protests, unrest, and property violence, and it comes on the same day as the commemoration of the 1963 March on Washington, where the families of an ever-growing list of police and vigilante violence victims will appear with civil rights leaders. According to its agenda shared with the Associated Press, tomorrow's live stream broadcast will include policy proposals on such issues as voter suppression, reproductive rights, inequality in public education, housing insecurity, and intercommunal violence. The Movement for Black Lives, a coalition of more than 150 African-American groups, organized the event. In 2016, the coalition released its Vision for Black Lives policy platform, which included early proposals for defunding police. The new agenda revamps much of that original platform with specific proposals that could lead to an eventual abolition of the criminal justice system as it exists today. Similar to the Democratic and Republican conventions, much of tomorrow's Black Lives gathering will feature pre-taped conversations, performances, and other presentations, including 28 mini-documentaries on the issues and addresses by Black organizers in California, Minnesota, Kentucky, and Wisconsin. Tomorrow's convention is expected to be the largest gathering of Black activists and artists since the historic 1972 National Black Political Convention in Gary, Indiana, which concluded with the introduction of a National Black Agenda. Earlier tomorrow, the Reverend Al Sharpton and Martin Luther King III, a son of the late civil rights icon, will hold a commemoration of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Sharpton and King will be joined at the Lincoln Memorial by the families of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and Jacob Blake, as well as representatives of Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner's families. The Black National Convention broadcast begins after the D.C. March has concluded. The nearly 4-hour-long event will be live-streamed on the website blacknovember.org. A judge in Washington today halted the federal government's planned execution tomorrow of a man who kidnapped, raped, and killed a 10-year-old Kansas girl, saying the law requires the government to get a prescription for the drug it plans to use. In an opinion early today, U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan said a federal law that regulates drugs requires the government to get a prescription for the lethal injection drug pentobarbital, which it plans to use to execute Keith Dwayne Nelson. The government is appealing. Nelson's execution is scheduled to be the 5th carried out this year by the federal government at the death chamber of the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. The executions followed the Trump administration's announcement last year that it would resume executing death row inmates for the first time since 2003. Nelson was sentenced to death after pleading guilty to the 1999 kidnapping, rape, and killing of Pamela Butler. The 10-year-old was rollerblading in front of her Kansas home when Nelson abducted her. He later raped her before strangling her to death with a wire. The judge's 13-page opinion came hours after the government carried out the execution of Lesmond Mitchell, the only Native American on federal death row. despite objections from many Navajo leaders. With Mitchell's execution, the federal government has now carried out more executions this year than it had in the previous 56 years combined. And 2 more executions are scheduled for September. Antonia Gonzalez reports on the execution of Lamont Mitchell.
The Navajo Nation is demanding respect by the federal government, saying it will not be pushed aside after the government executed a Navajo man Wednesday in Indiana. In a statement, the Navajo Nation expressed sadness to all families involved and called on the government for a meeting to address the death penalty matter. 38-year-old Lesmond Mitchell, the only Native American on death row, was executed by lethal injection for the killing of a Navajo grandmother and granddaughter in 2001. The tribe stood against the death penalty and instead asked for a life sentence. Leaders of the Navajo Nation say it's a sovereignty issue and the death penalty goes against cultural beliefs which were ignored by the federal government. Attorneys for Mitchell in a statement said the federal government added another chapter to its long history of injustices against Native American people, and despite pleas from Navajo leaders, other tribes, and Native organizations, the Trump administration executed Mitchell, a Navajo man, for a crime against other Navajo people committed on Navajo land. The U.S. Supreme Court denied a request, and letters for clemency were sent to President Trump by the National Congress of American Indians, 13 tribes, and more than 230 individuals. The Indianapolis Star reports a statement read at the execution from the victim's family said they waited 19 years for justice and hoped this would bring some closure. There were reportedly no witnesses on Mitchell's behalf at the execution. I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
Thousands of Californians forced to flee their homes were allowed to return to them today after firefighters made progress in their effort to put out massive and deadly wildfires circling the Bay Area. According to CAL FIRE, in all, the 3 large fires have claimed 7 lives and destroyed 1,800 buildings. Cooler weather and higher humidity, along with an influx of equipment and firefighters, continue to help hard-pressed crews fighting some of the largest fires in state history. At a morning briefing, CAL FIRE Operations Chief Mark Brunton said more resources are continuing to flow in.
We were seeing everything from engines, we were seeing crews, which we desperately need, and we were putting them directly to work.
The Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office lifted its evacuation order for the University of California at Santa Cruz as firefighters continue to make progress in battling the so-called CZU fires in Santa Cruz and San Mateo counties. The CZU blaze is 35% contained. CAL FIRE raised the known number of homes and other structures destroyed to 640. Virtually all of them in Santa Cruz County. Officials are working on plans to repopulate other evacuated areas, including the North Bay LNU fires, which have killed 5 people and still threaten 30,500 homes. 2 of the dead were identified as 82-year-old Douglas May and 64-year-old Leon Bone, both of Vacaville. They died on August 19th. Evacuees in Solano County were also allowed to return home today. Evacuation orders were lifted for about 35,000 people in Napa and Sonoma counties on Wednesday. The LNU fire jumped a highway and threatened homes in neighboring Yolo County near the community of Rumsey, prompting new evacuations for Yolo and nearby Colusa County. 1,080 homes and other structures have been destroyed in that blaze. The LNU fire is now 33% contained. Firefighters also continue to gain headway on the SCU blaze in the East Bay. Evacuation orders were lifted for Stanislaus County today. Rick Rocchini is a CAL FIRE information officer.
The SCU Lightning Complex remains the second largest fire in California history to date. The incident is currently at 368,000 acres in size with 35% containment. There's over 1,900 firefighters fighting this fight. A total of 37 structures have been destroyed. There have been 3 first responder injuries and 2 civilian injuries.
The National Weather Service is forecasting clearer skies and warmer weather tomorrow. Just over 1 million people applied for unemployment benefits last week, a sign that the coronavirus outbreak continues to take its toll on jobs and businesses. More than 14.5 million are collecting traditional jobless benefits, up from 1.7 million a year ago. A sign that many U.S. families are depending on unemployment checks to keep them afloat. Last week, nearly 608,000 people applied for jobless aid under a new program that extends eligibility for the first time to self-employed and gig workers, up from 525,000 the previous week. That figure is not adjusted for seasonal trends. The number of initial jobless claims has exceeded 1 million for every week but one since March, an unprecedented streak. You're listening to the Evening News in KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org.
Hi, this is Mitch Jeserich, inviting you to join us on this radio station for Pacifica's live coverage of the Republican National Convention, starting Monday, August 24th, and going through Thursday, August 27th, starting each night at 7 p.m. on the West Coast and 10 p.m. on the East. We'll have the main speeches, we'll talk to progressives, and yes, we'll talk to conservatives too, and we'll be taking your calls. So join us for Pacifica Radio's coverage of the Republican National Convention.
Infectious disease specialist Dr. Anthony Fauci says he was not involved in drafting new CDC guidelines, which say that asymptomatic people exposed to someone with COVID-19 need not be tested. Fauci told CNN he was under general anesthesia in the operating room for surgery on a polyp and was not part of any discussion or deliberation regarding the new testing recommendations at the White House Coronavirus Task Force meeting. Fauci added that he was, quote, concerned about the interpretation of these recommendations and worried it will give people the incorrect assumption that asymptomatic spread is not of great concern. In fact, it is, Fauci said. Other outside experts have been expressing alarm and outrage at the new CDC guidance, calling them bizarre and potentially dangerous, and raising the suspicion that the CDC was caving into pressure from President Trump, who has frequently said the U.S. wouldn't have so many COVID-19 cases if it conducted fewer tests for COVID-19 infections. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi took up the issue this morning. She criticized Trump and the Republicans for not following science when it comes to global warming or the coronavirus. She pointed to the climate crisis-fueled wildfires in California, Hurricane Laura, and Trump's shifting and unscientific statements about COVID-19, culminating in the new CDC guidance.
And the CDC for the Oval Office should be determining what the criteria are for someone to be tested. The president doesn't want any more tests because that tells us that we have more cases. Those tests are causing the infections. Really? How unscientific is that?
Global coronavirus infections have topped 24.5 million cases, with more than 834,000 deaths around the world. In the U.S., the nation has surpassed 6 million coronavirus infections today, and more than 184,000 people have died in this country from the virus. All but one of the Republicans in the California Senate were barred from the state capitol today after they were exposed to the coronavirus, prompting unprecedented changes that will allow them to vote via video conference from their homes as the legislature rushes to complete its work by a deadline of Monday. Republican Senator Brian Jones confirmed yesterday that he had tested positive for the virus. On Tuesday, he attended a Republican caucus lunch where 10 of the 11 members sat around a large conference table and removed their masks to eat. Those senators were scheduled to be tested for the virus today. Meanwhile, the state Senate met and passed 30 bills and confirmed 6 of Governor Gavin Newsom's appointments. all while most Republicans were unable to vote. Some Republicans were furious. A group tied to anti-government extremist Ammon Bundy is holding meetings and rallies across the state of Montana to oppose COVID-19 public health measures. Eric Tegetoff reports.
That's according to the Montana Human Rights Network, a progressive group that follows extremist activity. Travis McAdam with the network says the organization, known as People's Rights, has contended that mask requirements are a form of government overreach, despite their effectiveness at slowing the spread of the virus. He says the group is preying on people's vulnerabilities.
There are people all over in our communities who are scared, who don't really know what to do. They're looking for answers, and people like Ammon Bundy are more than willing to come in and try to capitalize on that fear and recruit people into these groups.
People's Rights denies links to Bundy, who was part of armed standoffs with the federal government in Nevada and Oregon. But McAdams says the group's state coordinator, Nick Ramlow, has discussed his close relationship with him. Bundy also is featured in a recent post on People's Rights' Facebook page. McAdams says some of the folks coming to local chapter meetings for People's Rights may not know Bundy is associated with the group, and that could be for a good reason. He says the name has political baggage that could turn off Montanans. This week, Bundy was arrested as part of protests against Idaho's special legislative session, where some have showed up armed, clashed with state troopers, and disrupted the proceedings.
That's the Bundy way. It's about bullying, it's about force, it's about divisiveness, and we don't feel that any of those are beneficial to be sort of driving how people are thinking about their communities.
McAdams says communities are the ones that bear the brunt of protests against public health measures. He encourages people who want to stop the spread of COVID-19 to stand with officials fighting the virus.
Showing support for local public health officials, showing support for local public health departments, local schools, all of the people in our communities that are trying to make the best decisions they can to protect the community in these really trying times.
For Public News Service, I'm Eric Tegedoff.
A key measure that could permanently strip badges from California police officers who commit serious misconduct barely cleared a key state assembly committee hearing yesterday. It faces an uncertain future in the full state assembly in the final days of the legislative session. Democratic State Senator Steve Bradford said his bill would end what he calls the wash, rinse, and repeat cycle of officers moving from one police department to another, even following brutality against civilians or other misconduct. Bradford's measure is among 10 policing reform efforts that Democratic lawmakers promoted as a package. Others include banning the use of carotid or chokeholds and restricting the use of tear gas and rubber-coated steel bullets against peaceful protesters. KPFA's Emma Herdsman reports.
The bill would allow for permanently stripping away the badges of officers found to have committed serious misconduct, ending what Democratic Senator Stephen Bradford of Los Angeles calls the wash, rinse, and repeat cycle of officers moving from department to department, even if they have a questionable history. Senate Bill 731, the Kenneth Ross Jr. Police Decertification Act, is named after Kenneth Ross Jr., a black man who was shot in the back and killed by a Gardena police officer in 2018. Michael Robbins, the police officer responsible for the shooting, was transferred to the Gardena Police Department from Orange County after being responsible for 3 prior shootings.
We're a state of only 5 states in the nation that doesn't have a police decertification program. We don't require any follow-up after they initially receive their certification, unlike other professions. We don't even have a process for requiring departments to complete an investigation after an officer has resigned or been fired due to misconduct. In fact, our current system incentivizes officers to leave a department before they're held accountable for their actions and move to a different community. We see this every day.
Critics of the bill, notably the California Police Chiefs Association, the California Association of Highway Patrolmen, and Peace Officers Research Association of California, say that the bill is too broad-reaching, arguing that it could potentially jeopardize officers who act properly. Attorney David Mastagni spoke to the Judiciary Committee on behalf of the police unions. He claims that the bill could strip police officers of due process.
There's also, in my view, different determinations that
can be made between an employing agency and a licensing body, and we see that in other professions like lawyers with the state bar, medical licensing boards, nurses. If it's something that is serious, such as stealing from a client, then presumably the state bar would revoke the license. If it's a mistake, it may be some lesser punishment. And that is the framework that we had been working towards, and frankly, we're disappointed that the latest iteration of this bill seemed to move farther apart from that commonality and those principles of fundamental rule of law, due process, and fairness.
The bill would create a 9-member disciplinary panel with 3 law enforcement representatives and the rest with backgrounds opposing police misconduct. Police are working on their own proposal. It would leave all investigations to local agencies and only allow decertification of an officer if they've left the department or committed 3 acts of serious misconduct. The advisory board would be composed of mostly law enforcement. Senator Bradford explains why the police approach would not satisfy public demand and how it leaves the public vulnerable to attacks by police, who often face no repercussions.
There's concern that this is biased toward officers and that the composition is not similarly compared to boards of other licensed professions. The truth is that the public does not trust law enforcement to police themselves. We've seen too many examples. From millions of protesters across this country who have rallied behind the murder and execution of George Floyd to this past Sunday shooting Mr. Blake in Wisconsin. People do not trust the police to do this job.
Democratic Assemblymember Ash Kalra of San Jose is a co-author of the bill. He says that anti-Black racism is embodied by the police force. It's a systemic issue and not one that can be solved using old approaches.
The anti-Black racism and violence that's systemic in policing, as we're recognizing nationally. It doesn't mean that individual police officers are bad. That's what systemic issues mean, is that we can't separate ourselves from that just because we're a good or bad person. Everyone prefer to police themselves. Nobody wants someone else looking at their conduct and saying you're not, especially independent investigation, that you're doing it right, or you should do it this way, or you should do it that way. But the reality is necessary.
Several lawmakers and advocates said that police associations showed that they aren't sincere by declaring support for many of the reform concepts, but now opposing the bills themselves. Democratic lawmakers supported Bradford's bill despite having their own concerns with details they said can be fixed later. The committee passed the bill for a possible floor vote Monday, meaning that the fate of police reform in California may be largely decided over this weekend. I'm Emma Herdman for KPFA.
A New Zealand judge sentenced the white supremacist who slaughtered 51 worshippers at 2 New Zealand mosques to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It's the maximum sentence available in New Zealand, and it was the first time a judge had ever imposed it. Judge Cameron Mander said the crimes committed by 29-year-old Australian citizen Brenton Harrison Tarrant were so wicked that a lifetime in jail could not begin to atone for them. He said they stemmed from a warped and malignant ideology. After the sentence was announced, survivors of the shootings raised their hands and fists in celebration. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern spoke after the sentencing.
This has been a crime in New Zealand, the likes of which has never occurred before. And now we've seen a sentence the likes of which we've never seen before as well. But yes, it gave me relief to know that that person will never see the light of day.
During the 4-day sentencing hearing, 90 survivors and family members recounted the horror of that day and the trauma they continue to feel. The March 2019 attacks on Muslims praying at the Al Noor and Linwood Mosque in Christchurch shocked New Zealand, prompted new laws banning the deadliest types of semi-automatic weapons in the country. Mostly sunny around the San Francisco Bay tomorrow with a high of 70 degrees. Further inland, sunny as well with highs in the mid-90s. In the central San Joaquin Valley tomorrow, sunny and 100 degrees, partly cloudy in Los Angeles with highs in the upper 80s. That's it for the news tonight for this Thursday, August 27th. Thanks for joining us. Coming up next, the Republican National Convention. Good evening.
This is a community announcement for August 2020. Help is always available on San Francisco Suicide Prevention's crisis hotline at 415-781-0500. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255. For more information, visit sfsuicide.org or suicidepreventionlifeline.org. This COVID Coping Community Calendar is produced by the First Voice Apprenticeship Program. Please send your listing for consideration to KPFA at 1929 Martin Luther King Jr. Way, Berkeley 94704, or email calendar@kpfa.org. To hear this calendar again, call 510-848-6767 extension 621, or view it online at kpfa.org.
You're listening to 94.1 KPFA, 89.3 KPFA.